where did I go? Okay. Hello, welcome to another online cover seminar, and today we're joined by Erin Manning. Now, I'm not going to do a formal introduction to you, Erin, other than to say that you've been doing lots of cool things for different years, and one of the things I particularly like about your work is you're working in philosophy and cultural theory. You're working in dance, you're working in fabric design, you're doing a bunch of, you're not just doing one thing, but doing a whole bunch of things, which I like, because sometimes we get too caught in just writing and just one practice. So it's nice to have bring someone who's working across multiple different practices. And I think you're going to be talking about a project with your sort of you're talking about, sorry, I actually have a copy. Talking about a project that goes into this book. So I'll leave that as intro and turn it over to you. Is that cool?
That's cool. Thank you. Thank you for everyone for showing up. I don't want to talk too long. I've got a few things, but I might just watch the time and stop myself, because it's most interesting to me to be in conversation. So I'll just say give you a few pointers to what I'm about to do. So the book Out of the Clear was really important for me that it be published by Minor Compositions. It's the first book that I've published outside of the academic world, except my first book, which was a novel. And it was important to me because the work of Out of the Clear is connected to the Three Ecologies project, which is para-institutional proposition. That in the very beginning, 20 years ago, when Brian Masumi and I were thinking about, we did talk about as an alter university, but we don't think of it like that anymore at all. We really think of it as a proposition turned toward the environment that thinks about living and learning otherwise, and that is strategically duplicitous, and to the degree that it catches everything it can in the surrounds and tries not to replicate it, so whatever the university does well, it tries to mobilize, and whatever other environments do well, it tries to mobilize. The book was written at a moment where I really didn't think I was writing at all. The first year of the project was very difficult and exciting, but mostly difficult, because Brian and I don't have any skills in any of the areas that matter, it turns out. And so we don't know how to fix generators. We don't know how to understand solar panels. We don't know how to build houses. We pretty much don't know anything, it turns out. And we're surrounded by equally creative people who know very little. So we spent a lot of time in a lot of anxiety, trying not to ask each other what the hell we were thinking. And in the midst of all of that, I guess I was writing, and it surprised me to find out I was writing. It tends to be my way to write when I'm confused, and I've never written for someone in the sense that I'm writing an article for someone. That's not the way that I write. I write more when I'm in a tumult and I need to work something out. And so to my sort of surprise, I found out I'd written a book. And so the book Out of the Clear traces the paradoxes and the uneasinesses in the first year of the project, particularly around some pretty dogmatic ideas I'd had about ecological work and environmental work, and around the a kind of pristine notion of what a life beyond or after fossil fuels might look like. And the challenges in the North, in the Canadian North, and this isn't even the Canadian North, though it's the end of the roads. So beyond this, you find some dirt roads, and of course planes fly into the more northern areas of Canada where the reservations of Indigenous people are, and of course all of this is Indigenous land. But this is sort of the inhabited North, the limit of it. And in the inhabited North, or the majorly inhabited North, I don't want to give the impression that nobody lives norther than here. You can't live on solar alone because we don't have enough sun. And the sun is too low, November, December, especially, and into January, which means that everybody who has solar has generators. And then in order to get out here, you need to have cars. We never owned a car. And so there were all these issues that became sort of complicated for me, for us, in thinking about alternative environments, alternative propositions for an ecological world. So the book itself is sandwiched between two, you might call them movements or series of scenes that are quite literary in the sense that they tell stories. And in the middle of that, there's a puzzling out of the concept of the impersonal that comes chiefly from the question of how we do collective work. For 20 years, or more than 20 years now, we've been doing collective work, first as Sense Lab and now as 3E. And we've always had an intuition that the force of the collective is in the impersonal. The impersonal not being a kind of other to the personal so much as a transversality that troubles the question of the personal. And then the other concept that I'm constantly sort of puzzling with is the aesthetics of the earth and the question of blackness. And so the middle of the book is around these questions of nature, of aesthetics of the earth, of the impersonal. And at the end of the book, the very end, is an interview that Brian and I did after the first year, and we do a very different interview now because we're a little bit more confident. We've had wonderful residencies. We're just about to go into the third year of the sugaring off. So I'm hoping that we can have a conversation around all of those things, but I just wanted to set the tone by reading a little bit from the beginning and the end. Scene 1. Barkskins, a novel by Annie Proulx, is a literary account of the violence of clearing that was endemic to settler colonialism in Canada and the northern US at the time of early colonization by the French and later the English. Starting with the early arrival in the 1600s and continuing to the multi-generational raping of the land by the steady influx of colonizers, the book relentlessly marks the passage from plenitude to desecration, the forests denuded at the cost of upheaval and death of the people who had never sought to clear them. This story is ultimately not about the trees, of course, but about the violence of cultural clearing and the genocide it leaves behind. And yet it is also about the trees, about those enormous pines, the forests unimaginable, the pristine, quote unquote, before, when lands were rich and people lived out of the clear. As these accounts do, the story begins with a Frenchman, Trépigny, and though First Nations characters make their way into the story and even become main characters, the reader never forgets that it is the colonizer who enters first and who makes the first cut. The scene is as we expect it: black flies, mud, rain, dark, vast forest, inimical wilderness. How big is the forest? One of the early colonizers asks. It is the forest of the world. It is infinite. It twists around as a snake swallows its own tail and has no end and no beginning. No one has seen its farthest dimension. The first tree, made into a great old single board pine table, serves as a motif for all that has been violently stolen, for all that has been falsely claimed into ownership, for all that has been condoned in the cementing of the notion that nature is owed and owned. The table, which will eventually be bequeathed to the half-breed daughter by the white colonizer father, will be fought over, claimed by his sons. They will argue that the Indian cannot see its value, that she has no use for it, and that it is rightfully theirs. She will appease them, agreeing that she does not see its value. Quote, she rapped her knuckles on the pine. She said she did not know why Outger was so passionate about it. He asked after it in every letter and would undoubtedly be angry when she told him it was gone. She will not lay claim to it, will refuse to see the value it has in the white man's eyes, but she will also refuse to give it back. Because the table, she understands, represents the experiment that she has become. Well, I can see now that all his pedagogy was an experiment. The books and instruction had been his attempt to make her into something like a learned white man, like himself, end quote. Unclaimed, the table will have done its work, teaching her with all the demoralizing splendor that comes with colonization that she can neither inhabit the world of the white man, nor ultimately become Indian enough, no matter how much she tries. But she said, I could not become an Indian. Of course not, said Dr. Mukhtar. There is a whole world of signs, symbols, and spirits which must all be absorbed from birth. You could not hope to grasp the meanings except by living the entire life, end quote. The table stays as the scar of a life stolen. Eventually, it will fall into oblivion like the rest of the, quote, largest white pines that ever grew in the world. But the memory of its infinitude, of all the potential violated, will continue to haunt the clearing. Scene 2. We already know how the story ends. On May 29, 2021, the headline reads, Canada mourns as remains of 215 children found at Indigenous school, end quote. It wasn't an Indigenous school, of course. It was a residential school, a Canadian school in the clearing. The picture says it all. Sparse trees growing in the background, empty yard, an architecture completely at odds with the environment, cleared of life, of all that imminently interconnects. The violence of logistics is inscribed in the ghost trees of its whitened surround. How we organize bodies, we who sidle whiteness, how we excise from clear sight the ravages of an earth desecrated, of a people brutally murdered. These are the workings of logistics. Logistics mediate existence by keeping it at arm's length, soothing us into believing that we are not responsible. The deaths are newsworthy and we're sorry, but we must move on. It's not really about us. And in any case, there's nothing we can do about it. Let's get a mediator and sort this out. At arm's length, we see these workings, the cleared forest, the dying planet, the dead children, as somehow disconnected. We do not acknowledge the felling of the trees as the wanton destruction of all that transversely connects. And yet logistics, in its power of mediation, is all about the forests. It's all about the cotton planted in their wake. The ghostly outline of Prue's pine table haunts the residential school, its absence equal to the absence of education. Because what the residential school really does is unteach. Taking the place of pedagogy, what is practiced here is theft. Theft of thought, of imagination. This theft is a rape, a physical rape, a sexual aggression, but also a conceptual rape, a clearing, quote, to snatch, to grab, to carry off by force, of all that lives in the abyss of what has been left behind. Rape, relation severed, cuts the fragile interwoven threads of existence, wresting life from life living, from the more than that gives it its spirited and spiritual contour. If body is land, if bodying is only ever worlding, what residential school does in this most recent form of clearing is sever this imbrication, leaving the body lifeless. All that remains is the clearing and a mess, but this can be handled. This is how mediation does its work in the name of and as logistics. From here on in, things will be managed. Managers will be appointed to organize, to administer the now reduced environment. This science of loss, quote, which is to say the science of whiteness or logistics, that's Stefano Harney and Fred Moten, is predicated on the end of sharing, on the destruction of the excessive share, the annihilation of that which exceeds the 1-2 form, whose dramaturgy relies on the intervention of the mediator. The mediator will take the form of the, quote, yellow eyebrows, in Proust's account, but it also need not take a simple human form. Repetition of the same is the form it takes in a dramaturgy of extinction. Scene 3. Clearing produces property. Property produces dispossession. To quote Harney and Moten again, all property is loss because all property is the loss of sharing. The accursed share of all that exceeds interpersonality, mediation, whiteness, logistics, all that cannot be accounted for, sickens the field and sometimes rejuvenates it. The force of the trans-individual, of all that exceeds and precedes the individual, does rewild, but its vitality is weakened, and as perception is honed to single out the individual over the field, the human increasingly becomes the focal point, becoming synonymous with life. This is how the logistics of genocide, the genocide of relation, does its work. The genocide of relation can never be traced back quite. Relation cannot be propertied. What is lost cannot be parsed. The yellow eyebrows have a role to play, of course, and we could call on the Archbishop for that missing apology. But the truth is, it was never just one. He was never just the one. He is a logistical pattern, a commitment to the dramaturgy of white man as a self-centered orchestrator of existence, cleared. To quote Harney Moten again, logistics aims to straighten us out, to untangle us, and open us to its usufruct, its improving use. Such access to us, in its turn, improves the flow line, the straight line. And what logistics takes to be the shortest distance between us requires imploding us as bodies in space, where interiority can be imposed, even as the capacity for interiority can be denied, in the constant measure and regulation of flesh and earth. Scene 7. Felix Guattari wrote The Three Ecologies in when what have come to be known as his winter years. The winter years came after a sustained attempt at working with the Green Party in the aftermath of the terrible letdown of post-1968 politics in France. This attempt to connect to state politics left Guattari with a sour taste. He knew better, of course, than to trust state politics to be a site of transformation. Schizoanalysis had been the wager that there were other ways, that to work, quote, in common, quote, toward the common, is ultimately always to commit to the logic of mediation. In The Three Ecologies, he makes a plea to invent new ways of being committed to and involved in the urgent call to transversalize experience, ways that move beyond how the state lays claim to existence through what he called a new echosophic logic. There is an echo here in this echosophic call to Moten and Harney, and I quote them again. Rather than dissipate our preoccupation with how we live and breathe, we need to defend our ways in our persistent practice of them. It's not about taking the streets. It's about how and about what we take to the streets. What would it be and what would it mean for us jurisgeneratively to take to the streets, to live in the streets, to gather together another city right here, right now? Echosophic logic is a refusal of the clearing, of the ways in which we seek to inhabit the space already colonized. It recognizes the lure and understands the commitment to change that the gesture of taking the streets embodies. But echosophic logic asks a different question. What if instead we practice living by creating new conditions that didn't center us, that didn't inadvertently redeem that central and self-centering figure of man and its mediating logistics? What if we painted into the dérive of artfulness's angle on experience? What if we moved at the pace of that accidental detail, tangled with the weeds we have been wasting so much time clearing? Echosophic logic is an urgent call to refuse the ongoing clearing that denies, decries, and violates the force of Blackness in the ongoing genocide of all that resists the count. To refuse does not mean to face and challenge. Frontality, the neurotypical activity par excellence, only cements into place what is already there, what is already claiming the ground of existence. To refuse means to move into the accursed share of life living, twisting in the troubled interstice, to move with that anarchic share of existence that keeps giving life. And this concept of refusal would be also indebted to Tina Kant and Saidiya Hartman. For life living to thrive, life has to be activated at those interstices that exceed man. Life's expression as tangle has to be attuned to from the edges in. Conditions have to be crafted to honor what is not about us. This is what the First Nations and bark skins, of course, already knew. And for this, they were cleared. To see, to feel what was always already there, to pulse with a force of life living that cannot be claimed, owed or owned. This was always the crime. So that was from the first part, Out of the Clear. And this is now a few scenes from the last part, A Speculative Garden. Part 1, Scene 1. The trees are a concern. We invite him in to cull. The solar panels are shaded by the tallest ones. Decisions have to be made. We can't cut them all down. How much energy is enough? Sustainable, quote, capable of being endured, continuing to exist. The solar panels are really in the wrong place. More money should go into raising them, into pushing them above the treetops. Strange, this standoff with the forest, caught up with the desire to reduce the burning of fossil fuels, to not need the generator on those cloudy days where the sun just can't get through. He comes and we stand on the edge of the cliff and look out at the river. Which trees should fall? He points at trees, we nod or change our mind. No, not that birch, it's so beautiful. There is no rational standpoint. A bit of shade brought on by this one is not so bad, is it? But that one, yes, that one should go down with the conifers. I go down to where he is. He doesn't talk much. Instead, he holds his hands in front of his eyes, mimicking taking a photograph. Yes, he says. There's a path here, I say. Can we move the fallen trees off the path? I love the moss. He looks down. Yes, he says, we will make sure the path remains. The dog runs around us, excited by the sound of the chainsaw. Scene 2. We are disappointed. The sun is still not coming up high enough in the sky. November in the north is hard for solar sights. We would have to cut down all the trees, or at least their tips, to benefit from its weak glare. He's still cutting, moving, sorting. Every once in a while, I see him stand, look around, his photographic gaze scanning the surround. Sometimes he tells me something he sees. He is hard to understand. Some people tell me there's a story there. I think it's neurodiversity. He feels the forest, and for that, there are no words. Now he is cutting the downed trees into logs. Since we purchased the land, wood has been our most constant companion. Has there been a day when we haven't cut, split, carried, stacked, burned wood? The sun remains low. We return to the edge of that small cliff often, willing the sun to be higher. Scene 3. What does he see? What is the seeing feeling of a forest in a forest? I accompany him to the old growth maple forest where a number of trees have fallen on the sap line. The ease of flow the lines facilitate the ease of flow the sap lines facilitate is inversely proportionate to the work it takes to keep them up in the wake of fallen trees. I have purchased a small chainsaw, but the truth is, I can't see the forest. I walk behind him and listen to his quiet monologue. His language is always mostly unintelligible. I see him scanning, holding his camera hands in front of his eyes, catching the field in the frame. He says something about the beach. Did I understand correctly that its acidity is bad for the maple? We continue walking up the hill, checking each line as we cross it. Yes, he says, pointing at a large tree. That one needs to be down. See, it's unhealthy. It will fall in a year. Look, this one can't thrive. Yep, down. The dog runs in circles, sometimes returning to us with a branch. Whenever he spots a tree angling to fall on the line, he stops. He looks for gravitational angles, wonders about the direction of the wind. He knows how to topple the tree so it falls where it needs. He also knows when he should leave it alone. Scene 4. The lumberjacks in northern Quebec live in a subsistence economy that is largely extracted. And yet theirs is an attunement much more refined than mine when it comes to what needs to be left standing and what is in the way of the forest's ability to thrive. The mirror hands see both. They feel what is in the way and what is lively with potential. Despite all the cutting they've done, they know how to recognize a healthy environment, and they are practiced in a respect for its majesty. Theirs is not a maudlin gaze. Sustainability is not their language. The forest is their sustenance. And yet it would be wrong to say that their approach is not ecological in its care for the surround. I wonder how to square the extractivist subsistence stance with the sensitivity in the field framing. How to avoid falling into a moralist all or nothing stance about some imagined notion of an untouched, pristine environment. Part 3, Scene 1. The long winter colors existence in a play of light and shadow, the shades of light and dark and the layers of snow and ice, a slight tinge of blue-green, a reflection of the often starkly sunny skies, bright in the minus 30 degree weather, the contrasting greens of the evergreens, the quality of bark, dark brown and gray and green, these color the field. With the crisp and often excruciatingly cold air comes a certain tonality, a play of density, light become volumetric, not a monotone so much as a subdued rhythm, a low frequency, intense in its movement. Color is movement, imbuing more than painting the surround. With the burst of spring growth, a new angle of color's feeling tone permeates the landscape, its vividness as olfactory as it is visual. Thick mud, the remnant of more than a meter of snow, sinks us into the humus of the forest regenerating. Wildflowers will soon take over, a surprise always, in their persistent impatience to populate the post-winter barrenness. Paul Cézanne writes of, quote, coloring sensations that, quote, give light. Joseph Albers speaks of color action, of the feeling of color relatedness. That color is movement is a reminder that it is fielded in an excess of vision, in an opacity of relatedness, an action that can never be situated in the distantism of a body-world separation. Distantism is a concept from John Lee Clark, a deaf-blind poet. Color is relational movement, not object. Color is lived abstraction, speculative actant in a field as yet undetermined, movement of forces in tenuous contact. When asked how he produces this vibrant matter, Cézanne implies that it is nature that gives us the means of achieving it. Color is a plane of existence, feeling tone tuned toward a frequency that is not reducible to pigment, to red or blue or green. Color cannot be seen in separation. To see, feel color is to be in the frequency of its adjacency, as Tina Kemp might say. Cézanne speaks of fusioning, of prismatic heat. Quote, only volumes matter, air between objects to paint well, like sensation between thoughts to think well, end quote. The world coloring itself is the speculative at work, the affective interplay of the relational tangle. This feeling tone is met affectively. Spring comes with a feel of all that flows between, the flowering effect irreducible to any one plant. In the art of living well, the world's coloring beckons vistas that foster new modes of bodying, not sustainability, transversality. Scene 2. The three ecologies in overlap, the social, the conceptual, and the environmental. Not 1 + 1 + 1. But the production of subjectivity entangled across all planes of existence. Speculative reason pulses this production into act, pairing the field into its acuteness, fielding a foregrounding of what stands out. Another way of saying this, We are made in the interstices of the overlap, subjectivity produced environmentally in us, through us. Ecology is this thirdness, this in and beyond quality of an usness that is always in deference of itself. We are colored in this fielding, we the force of all that exceeds us, of all that is born of an excursion up the mountain in the culling for verve. Speculative reason makes us, we are its emergent valuation, we, nature. In moving color, there is only relational movement, its anarchic edge a taunt to any commitment to the representation of the useful. The art of life is a drive toward amplification, toward excess in an ethos of a pragmatics of the useless. The temptation in the distant is clear, is to make it useful in that particular way that moralizes the earth and our quote unquote return to it. Make it edible, make yourself independent, call yourself a survivalist. But there is no independence in this vista of the tangled surround. The feeling tone of existence transversalizing is relational through and through. Nature, quote, anything encountered by creative procedure, which may be procedurally construed as having been already in operation. Brian Masumi. To be in operation, activist philosophy. Quote, ultimately, the thinking of speculative pragmatism that is activist philosophy belongs to nature. Its aesthetico-politics compose a nature philosophy. The current arts in which it exhibits itself are politics of nature. Brian Masumi. Nature as a current art is thesis, sensation in the fold, feeling felt, in abeyance of the me standing out. Quote, in activist philosophy, to be is to be felt. Masumi. Scene 4. He pauses, catching his breath as we scramble over the logs, still on our way up, lifting dead branches off the sapline, liberating it from debris. He looks around, wipes his forehead, takes out a cigarette. The dog runs around us, trying to lure us into a game. But we are too tired to throw the stick, so we sit for a bit. He points at a mushroom, points to some chaga on the birch. I can't quite see it. We talk about all the ways it can be used as medicine, as infusion. Make coffee with it, he says, and laughs. Or at least that's what I think he says. I look again, trying to spot it. His hands on his face as he scans again, this time looking down toward the maple shack. Now he's looking at the mountain from a different angle, seeing, feeling its gravitational lines from the top, noting where the sap lines converge. He points to an old maple, showing me the infestation of ants and the signs of the woodpecker. The tree's weakness is being exploited. We won't take it down yet. It will produce sap for a few years yet, but then it will have to come down or it will fall on the line. What he sees, feels, the force of the pre-individual at work, the way the pre-individual sculpts time through its Tarkovskian rhythmic pressure. For there is here a cinematic quality, what Callan Curry-Williams might call an afterimage, quote, a type of lingering or persistence that stretches across vision and the auditory all at once. This, quote, sensual ensemble is lived, that's Moten, more prehended than perceived, which is to say, activated in the grasp of becoming a perceptual force. The tangle of relation pulses into being in the very same gesture that the perceiver himself is forested. There is no clear-cut separation. Being is becoming. Natures. Processes are moved into activity through the force of the pre-individual that courses through them. We become, at this interstice, our human quality quivering in the sensual ensemble. The ensemble in moving color is never a being. Quote, an individuation does not succeed another. Calm. It is not that there was a human perceiving and then a nature naturing. Quote, when people speak of imagining a new possible world, it's in the sense of rearranging relations and spaces, introducing new understandings of what we recognize as nature, as if we were not nature ourselves. Kanak. Nature is not a container. It is the carrying itself, the force that moves the pre-individual across the tangle of relation. Any form it individuates is replete with the tangle of all that is still moving through it. We are made in the crease of the encounters its prehensions activate. We are not other to these encounters. We are born of the problem nature poses. Quote, if a new individuation can happen to the already individuated, it is according to a pre-individual part that it contains and will function as a starting point for a newly arriving problem, end quote. Simondon. The problem motors existence. It is its speculative reason, as Whitehead might say. That is to say, nature is the quality of a problem activating fields of thought. In the encounters after image, nature's thinking is felt. This is what is seen, not seen, in the act of foregrounding, backgrounding. It is not the forest so much that is caught here, but the pre-individual of its pulsing composition, of our pulsing composition. Not one two, but one many, univocal. Thank you.
Clapping noise. Thank you, Erin. There's a lot there, and that's super interesting. I want to open it up to a conversation, of course. I'm not quite sure how to do that because I'm doing this off of my iPad, so I'm hoping people can just jump in rather than have to be called upon. But I will give it a start if that's okay. And because I kind of like how at the very beginning you sort of said that you used to think about Sense Lab as a kind of school, but now you don't. And I thought that was interesting because I find a lot of times when people leave the university to form a free school or whatever, they end up bringing along all the kinds of tendencies of extractivist approaches to knowledge, of certain kinds of disciplines. They bring along all this baggage without realizing it. And it struck me that I think it has a lot to do with also why you don't want to talk about this as a back to the land project, because by talking about back to the land or just finding the clear space, you bring along all those other tendencies, about colonial tendencies, extractivist tendencies, all these problems. And then I like how you end it with sort of the question of foreground, background, because it seems to be what you're doing is you're saying, what do you bring along that you aren't aware of? How do we foreground all that background stuff and say, what is it actually doing? And do we want it to do that stuff? Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, I struggle so much with the university, and I haven't, I've talked about it, I've written about it, but I don't believe for a second that institutions are not everywhere. So university is just one kind of institution, and I suspect that those of us who really struggle with it do so because we believe at some level that it could be better. Or it could be otherwise, and we see the magic that it's capable of, and then we want it to be, that magic to be emblematic of more than what it is, or we want it to be possible or in more instances than it is. And these days it's even more complicated for me, at least, to think that, because I see what's happening in Florida and what's moving through the United States, and I'm sort of breathless with anxiety around it, and fearful also about how I don't see any mobilizations, or I see so few mobilizations. And by that I don't mean that people aren't fighting. I just see a lot of paralysis. And so, what I'm thinking about all the time is how the university, and maybe even particularly my university, which I think is maybe one of the best in the world in this regard. I mean, in the sense of the potential that's still there, how in a way being in a place that isn't so bad, or can be good, or can be great even sometimes, is still very much a maker of docile bodies. And how the making of those docile bodies is really dangerous, I think, in regards to where and how we understand thought. So what I dream of is, I think, what everybody I know wants and dreams of, which is that thought be untethered to the making of docile bodies, that we be collectively capable of doing work which is much less concerned about producing the kind of aura of paranoia we're familiar with in the academic world around how we are valued and how we value each other. And so in the early years, when we were imagining 3E and we called it the Three Ecologies Institute, we did sometimes talk about it as an environment more orchestrated in terms of teaching and learning. We had lots of images for it. We thought sometimes of think tanks. We experimented with a lot of different ways of thinking about it. And one of the reasons for that is that, as some people probably know, I've been working for a long time with autistics in particular who've been excluded from the university. And I don't for a second underestimate the difference between people who are excluded and need to move through in order to revalue their existences, and people who have access and can be critical because in part they have access. So there's a different conversation to be had, for example, in relation to accreditation by those who've never had access to accreditation. And here I'm thinking about neurodiverse folks. I'm also thinking about people of color. I'm thinking about people in poverty. I'm thinking about Indigenous folks in Canada. You know, the numbers of people who don't finish high school are incredibly high among Indigenous communities. And I don't think it's, you know, whatever we call the university is the same across all of those spectrums. I think they're different. I think what we understand to be its value is different under all of those environmental headings, let's just say. I guess what I want to think through with 3E and what we want to think through with 3E are more maybe the problems at all of those interstices, and the transversality at all of those interstices, and the strategic duplicity at all of those interstices. So how do we work across all of those environments to produce the potential for bodies that can still thrive and live well? How do we create little pockets of life or life living that are generative of new orientations? You know, to come back to the question of fossil fuels, I have really seen that it makes a difference if you spend some time in a solar house, even if there's a generator. You know, because you learn something about the quality of the sun and the quality of the care that needs to be put into the surround. You know, if you have to get the snow off the panels every day, and I can't tell you how exciting it is when the energy comes in and you think, oh my God, today's the day I can finally wash. How weird is that? Like, you know, how weird is it to be excited about washing your clothes? But it is exciting when you've had, you know, 16 days without sun and suddenly there's 3 hours of sun. And I think that does produce a new kind of body, in the sense that the body attunes to the world slightly differently. But I also think we need to romanticize it in any kind of particular way. We can just become aware of it and then laugh a bit, as our friends in Arizona or in Melbourne, you know, have all the sun in the world but can't wash because they have no water, and feel for a moment lucky that we have water, and then realize, fuck, our environment is really shitty, isn't it? Because those of us who have sun don't have water, and those of us who have water don't have sun, and somehow we have to bring Arizona and Montreal or Quebec together in order to make this world. Like, I think we can have a sense of humor, because ultimately it's that sense of humor that's also going to produce life. And so I'm saying that because I do want to really emphasize what you said, Stephen, about this not being a back to the land project. It moved to the land because at a certain point we got priced out of the city. And the project is the giving back of the land to a commons, in the sense that once the debt is paid, the land will be perpetually open and free for collective work. It won't be taken out of the property market. A lot of the thinking of the project is about property and about what it about the necessity to produce sites where we can live without having to pay for land we live on, because as we are surrounded more and more by precarious folks, it's just becoming really obvious that you know, if you have to pay for property, there's very little time and energy left over for living well. And so how do we do that work? In part, I think there are lots of people all over the world trying to think about that. How do we make it possible to live without having to pay to inhabit the world, how to pay for your housing. That has become increasingly difficult in one of the cheapest big cities in the world, Montreal. And if it's become difficult in Montreal, I can only imagine how difficult it is elsewhere. And so the land here, what it does to us, I think, is it amplifies the third ecology, the environmental ecology, in a way that wasn't so easy for us to do in Montreal. That was our shortcoming, not Montreal's shortcoming, plenty of land in Montreal. But our tendency in Montreal was to rest more so in the conceptual and the social. And so being out here on the land forces us daily to be thinking in that transversality, and what it brings to the forefront, which I think comes out quite a bit in the interview at the end of Out of the Clear, is a certain kind of uncertainty around the speculative, that Brian and I became scared in the first year that we were losing the edge of the speculative. We were so pragmatically oriented, and that we were maybe scared of becoming moralizing in a kind of representation of the useful. Like people would come and open a book and we'd be like secretly thinking, could you not move some wood? Like, do you really need to read a book right now? We don't have time for this, And over time, we've started reading books again, thankfully. But we're very aware about how the very kind of urgent needs, daily needs, can make us feel uneasy about the speculative, and so that's a big part also of our thinking about sort of reclaiming the speculative at that edge. And the last thing I'll say is that one of the things that I think we can learn a lot from, and I'm sure this is the case all over the world, is that one of the ways in which I see people reclaim the speculative in these kind of contexts is that they don't bank their money. People live with enough. So Remy, the person I write about in the last chapter of the book, A Speculative Garden, the other day, I went up to him and said to him, I have this opportunity for you if you want it. He works for us often, and somebody wants to hire you. And he said, but Erin, well, he doesn't really talk, but I mean, he, in the way that I described that, he uses a few words and he gestures a lot, but just, gesturally, what he said to me was basically, I have enough. I don't need more, and part of that is the enough is then that he can build his greenhouse and get his seedlings ready. And enough is having enough gas in the car and being able to buy his beer and getting the stuff that he needs. And so part of the question of the speculative, which has always been an economic question for Brian and I, and more widely for Sense Lab and 3E, is also about the question of credit, to go back to, say, a conversation from Stefano and Harney. So I'll leave it there. I noticed there's a question from Matthew, so maybe I'll just read the question from Matthew. And point, the strategic duplicity becomes just strategic, and that's the danger. How do we kind of keep dancing the strategic to maintain the duplicity? I learn a lot from Stefano Harney and Fred Moten, and in this regard, or from the politics of refusal that I was talking about earlier. The Saidiya Hartman and Tina Kant, and honestly, I don't want to pretend that I know how to dance that. I struggle a lot with it. I constantly feel captured by the systems, or scared by them. What kind of strategic duplicity is at work in the question of owning property, managing bank loans. I'd love to hear other people, from other people, what they think. I guess the one thing I would say is that one of the things that seems very important to me is that those of us who have access whether it be access to the university upper echelons or to bank loans or to those modes of credit that are so deadly, that we manage that access, that we don't deny that access, that we mobilize it, and that we remember that we have far less to lose than young scholars, that we don't ask young scholars or young artists or young people in general to be the ones waging all aspects of the revolution. That seems really violent to me. In terms of the South Asian media, particularly where development is articulated only in terms of the clearing, if I understand, and would be met with ambivalence by the lower caste, class, tribal, sometimes resisted, sometimes welcomed, sometimes worked with, etc. Well, it's useful for us in a relatively privileged location to be aware of other attunements and theorize them. How do we think of those in the disenfranchised positions? Yeah, so actually we've been working on the question of caste and have started a collaboration with a really interesting collective in India called Barefoot Philosophers. You might know of Sarakai's work, who published the work with Gopal Guru, Cracked Mirror, and the more recent one, who's I have over here, but I can't remember, Experience of Caste, I think, or something like that. I would be careful. I would always be careful of making these sort of grand gestures between the enfranchised and disenfranchised, and I'll tell you why. There's a long history that I started with First Nations in Canada. So somebody called Krista has their sound on, so you know. There's a long history in Canada of working in other ways than the clearing, right? I mean, this is what Annie Proulx's novel is about. The clearing, you know, not only the clearing in terms of cutting down trees. We cut down at least 60 trees, and that's why I was writing what I was writing. It was, you know, I was thinking this through. But the clearing is a modality of setting up a field for mediation. So I was really trying to think with logistics and with particularly Fred Mountain and Stefano Harney's new book. The clearing is a habit that you know, you have to open up the field in order to then understand what the field is doing. And this is what I'm trying to think through. It's a very persistent habit in an extractivist environment. You know, when people come up to our maple forest, they often want to make a road through it. And it's a habit, you know, we have to then always explain how we're not interested in making a road through it. And so you know, I don't know enough about caste or about South Asia or about India to speak in any intelligent way about this, except to say that I do have some belief that we have that environments are complex in the ways in which they operate, and that we can learn across these complexities with each other. And yes, of course, I'm always aware that a certain amount of clearing is necessary for the capacity for economics. But I think we also have to recognize that the monocultures that we live by and on are not operated by people of lower, or at least are not made economically viable by people of lower castes or of lower incomes. These are enormous conglomerates that are committed to monocultures. These are not small farmers or small villages. And also that hopefully nothing I'm saying or doing feels dogmatic. I mean, the whole book is about the paradox, the uneasiness. We did cut down the trees and we do want solar. And we also do want trees, and we are planting gardens, and we do have a greenhouse, and we do want to grow things, and I do want red tomatoes. And I am interested in permaculture, and I am critical of permaculture, because I think in some ways permaculture is problematic, but in other ways it's really great. And I'm kind of wanting, I guess, to get away from those paranoid, what I think of as those paranoid academic tendencies, where we're always looking over our shoulder to see who's going to criticize us because we might have gotten it a little bit wrong. I'm wanting to think with an aesthetics of the earth from Guisan, think about all we can learn out of books from like the Poetics of Relation, not from an extractivist potential, but because they simply are brilliant, practice-based, operational, poetic environments that can teach us how to live. So when I think through Blackness, I'm thinking we have this extraordinary field of potential. Some of the absolute best thinkers today are thinkers who have been motivated and forced out of normative paranoid modes of thought we could call whiteness, in order to mobilize new modes of thought, and similar with neurodiversity. So this is really how I'm trying to think it. And I'm also thinking that if we don't manage somehow to be comfortable enough with all of these paradoxes, we will all burn out. We will all become so discouraged, because we can't all be doing the same kind of work. Some of us will have certain kind of degrees of strategic duplicity, others will have others. Some people, this is going to be different also from our temperamental differences. We're all going to be engaging differently with these questions, and I'd rather feel like we can be alongside than be in competition with each other around these kinds of questions. So that's that's a long answer to why I think the question of caste is really, really important. And then trying to learn everything I can from people thinking this through.
Can I ask a question? Do we have time for that?
We do.
Yeah.
I think we have till 10:30.
Okay, so I was really thinking with you about this against the paranoia of academic and the modes of writing and the forms of writing. As you were speaking and reading parts of your book, I was really mesmerized by the way that you articulated what you were going through. And the action or the living itself is a form of writing in and of itself. And then the way in which you put your ideas on paper and the way you think through. And I felt like I was there. I was moved in so many different ways as you were reading. I was put in the place of, and I felt like I was there in Montreal, or in the three ecologies place where you are. And I was thinking with certain writers, with Prue, with there's just so much going on. And I've read your books and thought with you for many years. And for me, it seems the writing is a little bit more narrative, if I could use that phrase. And I wondered if you could talk about the modalities of writing, or the ways of writing, and the how, not so much the hows of writing, but I feel like the writing and the articulation is also sort of against this sort of extractivist politics, against these ways of knowing, against the paranoia, as you were saying, about the, looking over your sort of typical academic writing. And I felt like there was a critique there in the modes of articulation that you're working with here. And I just feel like there's a lot there, and very instructive in a way, not dogmatic as you said, but in the ways in which you're articulating what's going on with you. And so maybe you could talk a little bit more about that. I don't know if I'm very clear, but I'm just sort of thinking through this.
Yeah, thanks for that, David. The book has different voices. I read from the scenes, in the middle of the book has 3 pieces that would probably be read as more academic. And it's a question I think about all the time. Sometimes I think that Well, I guess what I think is that the writing takes us on the journey that it needs to take us on. And I try to trust the writing to do that. So the first and last pieces of the book were written in some pain, in confusion. I mean, I wasn't joking when I said I didn't know I was writing a book. Like these would be written in bits and pieces, just really struggling. Brian and I bought the land. We were cheated when we bought the land. We lost a lot of money, and it was very complicated, and it was very painful, because we were pushed. We bought things that 2 parts of the land we bought didn't belong to the people who sold it to us. It ended up belonging to other people. The solar panels didn't work. We bought it in February. The generators didn't work. It was very scary, and there were a lot of fears also, economic fears, questions about, like, should we go down legal routes? And Brian and I decided not to. We decided that the quality of our life and the project were more important. But there were lots of confrontations like that. And I think in the midst of that, that's the voice of the scenes was the voice. Do you know what I mean? Like I really wasn't thinking about anything except just getting through. And sometimes, I mean, probably we all know this, but when you're doing a collective project, there's a certain amount of bravado. Like you kind of have to pretend it's going to be okay. Because if 2 people collapse at the same time, you're probably going to have a pretty, remarkable collapse, And so one of the things that had happened when we bought was that Brian said to me, well, that he maybe was too old for this. It's 100 acres. This is like really it's pretty wild out here. And I was like, you're not old. What is age? Age is nothing, And meanwhile, like we're shoveling at least 3 hours a day, like it's, he's been in physio, for shoulders that are sore, and they're like the question of the body and ableism really pushed to the fore. And for anybody who knows me, I mean, I work with deaf, blind folks and neurodiverse folks, and ableism is a question that I work with. And honestly, you can't do this if you're not able-bodied. You can't. There's no way. It requires an enormous amount of moving and lifting, and all of the systems are visually based, so like all of these paradoxes. And so the writing came from there. But then in the middle of the book, there's a piece that actually Greg also published in the Affect Reader, and it's a piece that went through, I had 20 rewritings, I think, and it's a piece that is much more paranoid in my vocabulary. Because it's a piece on Blackness, and I'm so scared of getting it wrong, right? So if I'm writing around Blackness, I will sound more academic, because there it's like the parentheses feel weighted. Like, am I citing the right people? Have I made it clear enough the love that I feel for this work? Have I inadvertently said something that could make whiteness reappear? But my dream is to be less paranoid, right? My dream is to be less scared. But I'm really aware that we live in a period in academia where there's really a lot of paranoia. We're like, those of us who are trying to do the right thing, whatever that is, are like falling over ourselves trying to do the right thing. And so then I also think about the essayistic style of so many of the French writers who have been so important for me, and how they maybe didn't try so hard to do the right thing. And I think here of letters, handwritten letters that Brian wrote to Deleuze and Guattari when he was translating 1,000 Plateaus, and writing to them and saying, I'm looking up this footnote and it doesn't lead to where you said it led, and can you help me? And then Deleuze writing to Brian, I don't know, ask Felix. And then Felix writing, I don't know, ask Deleuze, and this kind of feeling of, look, it's really your problem now. We wrote the book, go with it, go where you need to go with it. And so I think what I would say to people who are thinking about writing is, I think the more we're aware of the paranoia, the more honest our writing will be in terms of the modes it needs to take. And I don't think that this means like a more poetic style or a more academic style. Sometimes the academic style is really needed, at least for me, because it sort of manages a kind of tightness, a kind of precision that I feel really is necessary in that moment. I don't want to get it wrong, and I want to say something as clearly as possible. And then other times, you know, I don't really want to talk too much about Rémi's neurodiversity. So hopefully, you know, you guys get a feeling for it, but he's not the object of my discourse. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, and I think it raises again this idea of the, like you were saying, the paradox and the duplicity, strategic duplicity and things along those lines. And I feel it a lot. And so and you know that I do. So it's just a really kind of an ongoing question for me, and especially how I think about mentoring students and what I have them read and have them, you know, think about their writing and the way that they present who they, you know, what they want to say, and these sorts of questions. So yeah, that was perfect actually. And I do think that that there's a writing within the living, and so I'm writing my life in a way. And so that explanation was really great. So I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Are there other questions or things people wanted to pitch in? Say a few bits. Anyone? Stephen, do you want to?
Well, sorry, I'm just in a parking lot by my son's school.
Hello.
Hey.
Hello.
No, if everyone, if we've got a good point to sort of take a break, I just want to thank you, Erin, for coming along. It was super interesting. I'm going to have to listen to the past 30 minutes again because I was driving. Sorry about that. But thank you for the very much that, Erin, and thanks for coming along, everyone.